More than half a year passes without Palpatine, the Galactic Emperor and Conqueror of Worlds, doing anything significant in any of the continents. Africa still waited and reinforced its coastal defenses, as publicly the Free French support had increased and was allowed to be established in Africa as an independent governing organ. Japan continued with its warpath and a taste for blood. Mongolia had capitulated next, giving Japan a new angle to attack Russia that had already been invaded. Japan's power and influence spread like wildfire. They were now the most dominant conquerors, with Germany having mellowed army had set up heavy defenses near bridges crossing the rivers. By doing this, they created choke points and gave the stormtroopers absolute hell for every checkpoint they tried to conquer. But it was not just Brazil that had to deal with the invaders. Neighboring countries burned as well, and these had a lot more difficulty as they were smaller and less prepared. Peru was the next to fall, giving Palpatine's troops a long line down south towards the remaining nations that resisted. It took more than 2 months for the stormtroopers and clone troopers to traverse the Amazon, and now they were spreading throughout the country and off to Bolivia to the west as well. By now, Palpatine had lost almost 1 million of his own men. A while back, Earthen Intel stated that his manpower was at an all-time low. It seemed that the half-year of absence was used to resupply and reinforce and then by the second week of August, Argentina, the last major nation in South America, was lost as well. The alarms were raised, and the Soviet government pleaded the Japanese to stop, as this would only harm both armies in the end. But Japan did not give in. They saw their plead as weakness. Though there were some respected Japanese writers who questioned their government's views, and that they themselves underestimated the enemy galactic invader. The Soviets did not want to spend their best equipment and armor on the Japanese. It would be a waste for when they would get into conflict with Palpatine once more. But by not doing so, they handed some of the locations over to the Imperial Japanese on a silver platter. The Soviets had a ton of men available at all times, but the Japanese used Chinese replacements to always keep the pressure on them. Both governments forced many men to their deaths for a war that in the end might achieve nothing. The entire front line was also so wide that the Japanese always could get away with a victory somewhere. The huge increase in artillery and armor meant that Russian soil was difficult to get a hold of on many places, but not all places. Thinly spread areas were soon overrun by Japanese, who could then flank the heavier fortified position to move the entire army further west. For the next months it stayed quiet as the Galactic Emperor cleaned up the remaining nations that were still standing in South America. It was halfway through 1943 when intel suggested that Palpatine could have close to 3 million troops on the ground spread out throughout the Americas. But over time, the countries that joined against Palpatine increased too, and they assumed they had a combined fighting force of somewhere close to 8 million, almost 3 times that of Palpatine. Support bases, checkpoints, and hundreds of thousands of troops were being moved along the American ground. It was clear that a new target would soon be chosen. Japan made headway against the Soviets. They were underestimated by Stalin. This mostly came due to Russia dividing their resources and expenses between the two sides. On one end, they were battling the Japanese, but the others were preparing for another clash with Palpatine. The Japanese, on the other hand, were focusing all their resources on Russia alone. For months, Palpatine did not attack a single nation, but most knew they were at his mercy. Another half year went by, and then, in the first month of 1944, Palpatine's new target had been decided. He invaded Africa. The initial invasion force was small and used the African jungle as cover in the first few days of the new war campaign to keep their location concealed. But it would not be long before more troopers would arrive and the Emperor's might and darkness would spread throughout the ancient continent of Africa.